Hello, hello. Pete Oslin here with Bending Rules. I'm joined by Gabe Ayers, another entrepreneur, and we'll certainly get into his background here in a minute. Eric's not able to make it today. He's doing the right thing with his time, and he's playing volleyball up at Seaside, Oregon, which is probably where I should be too. But I had a chance to sit down with Gabe, and I wanted to continue that conversation in the spirit of the Bending Rules sort of theme. And, where we come here and we talk about all things entrepreneurial, the entrepreneurial story, the challenges, life events, anything that sort of surrounds that journey. And so Gabe agreed to join me today. And I know a little bit about his story because we had met at a mutual sort of networking thing around the Bend Venture Conference. But I actually wanted to save a fair amount of it for this discussion. I would put him, he's one of those entrepreneur types I put in the profile of the bootstrap, make it happen on the financing side. And I really love those stories, even though maybe that doesn't totally reflect my own story. I'm sort of envious of it in some respects. And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, financing is the biggest bottleneck. So how you kind of finance your way into a successful company like Gabe was able to build and that finds a meaningful exit. I mean, that's kind of the American dream. And he's also on to other projects and continues to, use his entrepreneurial skill set. I've gotten to know Gabe a little bit. I know that he probably doesn't turn it off very easily, and he's a young guy, so he did a lot of this at a pretty young age. And I don't know, I'm really kind of intrigued to hear more and excited to hear more about how that sort of unfolded. And I guess, for me, a starting place a lot of times with guys on this podcast where I may not even know them as well is just to think about kind of what are the origins of your entrepreneurism. Like, I'm always just curious more. Like, some people come from entrepreneurial families. Some people stumble in it because they lost a job and now they have to figure out something to do. Others sort of are in a domain a long time and see an ability to sort of exit out of that domain. I mean, there's a series of, potential ways that we go about building our businesses. So before we get into sort of how you got your company and did all that, tell me a little bit about you and your origins of your entrepreneurism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start. It's interesting that the first company I started when I was 15, and that was a web design company. I learned from a very good mentor of mine kind of how to do web design. He was doing some web design and computer repair work, and so I would go there every Tuesday after school and learn from him. And so I started figuring out how to do the website stuff. I'm not that much of a hobbyist. I really like to learn and figure things out, but I, for whatever reason, need to connect that to business. And so I don't really love going off and doing my own thing and figuring it out just for myself. It's like, okay, how can I do this in such a way that also generates revenue or generates some kind of business piece? Kind of those things together make it interesting. So learning how to do web design, it was like, okay, I can make my own website, but that's pretty boring. I don't have many great ideas, but there's all kinds of people out there who have really great ideas that may not be able to make the website. So let me go and start to do that for various different companies. And so
I'm still pretty fascinated by the fact you decided that at 15 years old. Like, I want to connect it to a business model at 15. Like, usually we're doing things, it's fun. Maybe we make a little money at the lemonade stand, but we're also just doing a lot of things to learn the trade or whatever. But, rephrasing a little bit, you're basically like, okay, I think there's an application for this and I got a skill set, and that's really, really interesting. Did you have parental influence there? Like, in terms of they were entrepreneurs like that and encouraged that behavior, or was this sort of an innate thing that I don't know if you had siblings that were like that, or what surrounded that sort of, that thinking?
I'm not sure that there was the parental influence in that regard. Specifically saying like you should go out and start your own businesses.
Yeah.
My dad was a contractor, so he kind of was doing his own business on that side. It's turned out that I have two brothers. We've all gotten into startup business, and so they run a backcountry ski binding company out of Driggs, Idaho.
Sweet.
And so that's become a pretty substantial endeavor over there as well. So I don't know what about our upbringing kind of put us into this space of feeling like we wanted to go off and do our own things. so there definitely was something there, but it's hard to put a finger on exactly what aspects of it push
Yeah.
us that way.
That's interesting. You all share those characteristics though, on
Yeah,
some level, So, okay. So we're 15 and you do the web design company. And I want to know where that goes. I'm going to digress because I do this a lot because you
yeah,
just hit on a topic that you may not even know, but you're talking backcountry skiing, you're talking Driggs, Idaho, and I'm a backcountry guy, and I love my backcountry binding. So, footnote, you and I are going to need to revisit that, and I might want to find a way to support your brother's
yeah.
company if it's a startup because I've been through Driggs and in that area and beautiful areas. So, non sequitur,
Yeah.
but darn it, I'm really excited about that. Back to your thing, 15. Okay, you start your website design business. Tell me a little bit what happens after that. Like you get some customers and
Yeah, so I had quite a few customers. I actually still have some of the customers
it's crazy.
to this day, but um, I mostly ramped that down in my mid 20s, but that was how I paid for most of my college living. So all of my college expenses were web design for the various different towns I was in at various different times. Um, and yeah, we made a good go of that. It was just me, but I had partners that I would bring in for various different projects, um, and grew the capabilities quite a lot. So initially, when I first started, it was kind of PHP days,
Yeah.
fully custom sites, and then that transitioned into the whole WordPress realm. And then I kind of phased out right about the time Squarespace came in because it started to be the thing. I'm not needed anymore. People can make their own websites, and I'm only going to want to work on something when I'm actually bringing value. Yeah. And I'm not going to sell somebody a bill of goods and say, hey, you don't know anything about web design. I'm going to sell you a website for $10,000 or whatever it is when you can go make it yourself on Squarespace just as easily. So yeah. I saw the writing on the wall there and realized that it was time to phase that out, and I was onto different things at that point. So
yeah, you got a lot of value out of that, though. I mean, one in terms of learning, exercising the entrepreneurial muscle, obviously, but I'd say in conjunction with that, I mean, my gosh, if it helps pay for school, and do that sort of thing. I hope my kids will listen to this episode just for that reason alone. I mean, with one in college right now, and no offense, kid, but he's kicking in a little bit, but yeah, I mean that's amazing, really. And you're able to do that and fulfill whatever you had for your ambitions educationally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I mean, good on you. I think you also touched on something though that to me is important in any sort of product endeavor or just in a company endeavor, especially with technology, right? Everything has a time horizon. And I think this is sort of one of these areas that I feel sometimes is overlooked. Like when somebody starts a company, they're like, oh, I'm going to build this thing. I'm going to sell the product and I've solved this need. I'm going to keep selling it. But then there becomes an inflection when that product's not valued as much or things become commoditized. And now you've got this company that's maybe not growing as fast and you have to reinvent yourself within that company or create a new product. I mean, basically you're being an entrepreneur again. Has that ever happened to you with any companies that you've been involved with? Or from there, was it the next idea or did you take time off? Or if you can relate to that phenomenon.
Oh, very much so. It's actually very a present situation for us to some extent. So we aren't talking about this yet, but I've started a new endeavor doing remote monitoring for boats and RVs, and it's a cellular connected product. It lets you know what's going on in your boat and also your RV when you're away from it. But we see a massive kind of shift going on right now from cellular to satellite. Uh-huh. And so everything with the new direct-to-cell satellites from Starlink and the various different providers out there, within the next 5 years, we're no longer going to be talking about terrestrial cell. We're going to be talking about satellite cell. And that's going to be just a massive shift in all the products that we're creating across our line. We are future-proofing ourselves as much as we can for that. Yeah. But that's something where we've designed a product. We have an entire suite out there that is meant to work with terrestrial cell. We see the writing on the wall that in 5 years, that's no longer going to be the case. Yeah. And so being able to design it from the beginning, knowing that that's coming down the road, I don't know what's coming after that. But also at the beginning of that cycle, when you first start the company, and what's the name of This is Rome Devices.
Rome Devices. Okay, so the boat RV monitoring capabilities. And you and I talked about that a little bit offline when we had coffee. And I do want to hear more about that. I think it's a really cool application having a boat myself. An old boat. I don't have this like fancy boat over here. So let's be clear on that. I could still benefit from that, especially since it's actually sitting out on a lake right now because of a fire and I can't get to it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a real thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so I have no idea what's going on. I'm not even sure I'll be able to start it, right? When this sequence of fires is resolved. And that I like that reinvention concept because I think I look at it as it's almost like you have to, what do they say, kind of disrupt yourself, and sometimes with technology, not to get into too much of the minutia of this right now, but why is it such a difficult transition from the cell to the satellite? I mean, I'm just more curious about that.
Your throughputs go way down is the underlying issue. And so we already use a system that is low data rate, kind of with the mindset that we're going to end up being in the satellite space.
Yeah.
Throughputs go down, cost of data goes up. I mean, you're going from a tower that you can put up on top of a hill to something you have to launch into space. By definition, that communication link is going to be more expensive.
Yeah.
And so it's figuring out ways to make sure that what you're doing is still cost effective and still affordable, but gives you the coverage that you're going to gain by being global, as opposed to by being connected to a tower. I mean, even if you go out to the mountains here, you lose signal pretty quickly.
Exactly.
And so you gain capability, but there's a lot of costs and there's more complexity as opposed to talking to a tower that is stationary and not moving and you're the only thing moving.
Yeah.
Especially with the direct to cell, which is it's a short range communication. You're talking to LEO, low Earth orbit satellites. And so they come overhead.
Yeah.
And if you've ever seen the Starlinks going overhead, they're there for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
They're not there for very long. And so you have to both make the connection, have the communication, lose the connection, and then know where your next satellite's coming from.
Yeah.
Every single 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And so there's just more complexity there.
You're fitting my entrepreneurial profile already just by the answer of your question, which I've said this on previous podcasts. I kind of love the pattern recognition concept of entrepreneurs. And again, that's not trying to put anybody in the same box, but one of the I think profiles is this sort of learning profile. Like I want to learn everything about the sequence of things that relates to my thing. Yeah. And I know this wasn't your space before, right? So we're going to do a little rewind and talk about how you got into your 2 or 3 companies you had done prior to this and why you're at where you're at today. Because I think that's super interesting too. But thanks for appeasing me on that because I know that was a little bit of a technical non sequitur. So coming back to you ran this web thing, you get through college, you see the writing on the wall for your company. What happens now? Like, do you go get a job? Do you?
Yeah, so I got pretty lucky at the end of my kind of senior year of college. I ended up working at MIT Lincoln Labs, which is a DoD research lab, and through various different kind of stars aligning, ended up being one of the kind of founding members of the energy group at Lincoln Labs. And so we were working on Department of Defense, mainly Army energy systems. And so these were kind of deployable power systems for forward operating bases, small microgrids, trying to limit the amount of diesel that we're shipping into the middle of the field, that kind of thing.
Are you an engineer by training?
Yeah. So I went to school for electrical software engineering.
Okay. That makes sense.
So focused on the power systems, electrical and communication systems for those microgrids.
Yeah.
But that was a really interesting place to start, starting at Lincoln Labs. I mean, that's a place where when you're looking up a subject, you go walk down the hallway to the guy who wrote the book.
Yeah.
And talk to him about it.
What a great, opportunity for you as a young guy. How old are you at this point?
So I started there when I was 20.
Okay. So you're a pretty young guy.
Yeah.
Everybody needs a break in life, a sequence of things that sort of launch them into, a platform that they can build towards. Can you just, I'm just thinking for the younger audience maybe listening to this and they're going to be in that same spot coming out of college or they're trying to get their intern. Was it pure luck or what were the things that sort of lined up for you to, really enter an entrepreneurial environment with like a rich, like a framework of people around you that have a lot of depth in their subjects essentially. Like how did that come about? I think that's a big stepping stone for you.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a substantial amount of luck. It was a very interesting evening where I just went up to campus. I was on campus, went to go grab myself a pizza, and I'm walking back to my apartment at the time. And one of my friends was walking the other direction, so I stopped and said, "Hey, like, how's it going?" He's like, "Oh, I'm going to this event to talk about MIT Lincoln Labs. Like, it's an internship program." And I had no idea this was happening. And I was like, I got my pizza. I'll go sit down. So
like most clueless college kids,
exactly,
like, just kind of cruising.
I was doing my own thing with the web design stuff. I wasn't super like clued in onto what my next endeavor was going to be at that point. So I went and sat down in the back of the hall, ate my pizza, and they opened by saying, "This is the last event. If you hadn't been to this event, you don't have access to this internship. So thank you for coming." And so I learned about this place, Lincoln Labs. I was like, "This is incredible," and signed the piece of paper saying I'm interested. Yeah. And then there was a series of interviews and steps that you had to go through to prove that you were capable enough to be working in this kind of place.
Yeah.
But that initial kind of kickoff of being able to be, like, turn around and go sit down and listen to this talk was that's kind of what I mean when I said the stars aligned in quite a few ways to put me there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was
that's
quite
cool.
lucky.
That's pretty cool. We all need luck on our journeys for sure. So you're now here and you're at the Lincoln Labs, and this is kind of, in a lot of ways, it's a job too, though. Like, you're doing I mean, you're not there to be an entrepreneur, so you're there to learn and, acquire new skills. So what happens there when you're there? Like,
yeah, so I was an intern there for a year, and actually then I transitioned into a full-time staff, and I worked there for 5 years.
Okay.
On those programs, and so that was a very defining area for kind of working on R&D.
Yeah.
And being in a situation where the common trope there is, if it's been done before, we are not doing it. And so that was a really cool environment to work in, is you never had anything of an idea of what the answer was when you started.
Yeah, you preempted my sort of question there, because I think one of the things I've observed with entrepreneurs is they have a hard time working in environments where they can't be entrepreneurial. And it doesn't mean initially that they're not going to work somewhere just to acquire some skills, but that time horizon tends to be really short if they don't feel like they're building a lot of skills. And so everything is making kind of sense to me why you lasted there 5 years, because they created a framework where you can be entrepreneurial. And maybe that impacts how you ran your companies later on, the people you hired, which I'm curious to hear about, like the infrastructure of your own businesses and how much latitude you gave people and autonomy. And, because this is something I want to riff with you on a little bit, because I think I got better at that as I got older, especially with my last company, recognizing that was the way I was sort of going to retain talent. So put a bit of a pin in that, but that's pretty cool that you found a job right out of college, essentially in college, 20, or unless you're getting out of it fast, accelerating through college, that gave you that framework. I mean, that is serendipitous. Okay, so now you're there 5 years. What happens at the end of the 5 years? Are you just decide it's time to transition, or does an idea develop, or what was sort of the?
Yeah, I mean, life started happening in different various ways, but I moved jobs to a company up in Vermont. So this was all in New England.
Yeah.
Great company doing embedded circuit board design, firmware development. And so that was a cool company that I also was able to bring. One of the projects that I was working at the lab kind of was transitioning into, needed to figure out how to be an actual product. So the lab works on research. It doesn't work on productization.
Yeah.
And so the Army was kind of saying, hey, we want to turn this into a product. Can we keep working with you? And so I brought that project into this other company, continued to work on it there, was there for about a year before leaving New England and heading west on my own kind of personal journey there. But in the process, continued to kind of work on those Army projects. And so that was the foundation of Apricity, which is the company that I founded and ended up running here in town.
Yeah.
But I started it in my transition as I was moving west, continuing to do the Army consulting on these energy systems and flying back east to go to the military bases for testing and everything every other week kind of thing.
So that gave you latitude to make the move here. You can sort of do it quasi remotely, it sounds like, as consultant. At this point, do you have the idea? Are you moonlighting at your Apricity. I mean, did I say that right?
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Apricity. Are you moonlighting with Apricity, or is there a kind of stark jump off point? When
It was a full jump off. I quit my job, left, founded Apricity, and actually moved to Driggs, Idaho, where my brothers are. Lived there for a couple of years while I was running this company, and so it was interesting to really. It was kind of more like my web design days, where it was just me, pitching myself, going out and getting much larger projects, and so these were 6-month projects that I was working on, 6 months to a year long projects. But that was it. I'd work on them for that period of time, and then I'd go to nothing and continue to look for the next project. It's kind of that consulting gig.
Yeah. Okay. But I want to. So, are you playing in a domain now? Like you've acquired domain knowledge, and so you have customer contacts already from your other businesses.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you feel like I want to know a little bit more specifically on the consulting aspect of Apricity, but you feel like I've got a value add here. I can go into these organizations that I've done some already consulting work with your previous endeavors, but solving a new problem essentially.
Yeah, and at that point, I was very keyed in on the microgrids for forward operating bases.
Yeah.
So I was the subject matter expert for this team in the Army of how to develop these microgrids. Wrote the initial standard for all that, and then was continuing to work to build those to make them more easily deployable, everything there.
Okay, this goes back to my pattern recognition, because I've seen with a lot of entrepreneurs, especially like technology ones, that don't go out and raise $20 million and say, I'm going to solve this problem in a massive, like what we'll say, horizontal way where somehow every consumer is going to benefit from this, or every business owner or whatever, that's difficult to do. It tends to be these sort of domain expertise areas that get built up where there's a high level of knowledge, like it is in your case. And you take that domain expertise and you build out more capabilities within that domain expertise in terms of what Apricity was able to bring to those organizations. I'm not going to pretend to understand the technical aspects of what you did because you are very technical person with your engineering background, but I get the outside looking in. And one of the reasons why I'm like belaboring on this a little bit, Gabe, for those that are listening, is that I think for me, I kind of see a lot of people like, oh, I think this would be cool if we did this thing, like solve this problem for a bunch of people. And it seems like, a printer could run better. I mean, but you don't really know about the industry and the moving parts of the industry. And I'll give you an example. I was listening to this Freakonomics podcast, and it was on failures. And this guy, it seems like a real logical thing, right? This guy said, hey, I got an innovation for a paint can, for painting houses, right? And we've all used paint cans, like everybody. So he had some knowledge, like, okay, I take out the paint, now it always spills, and you got the trays and you're trying to pour it. And he's like, I think he simply wanted to create a better pouring device on this. And he goes through this process and he invests in the prototypes and does all this stuff. And then he goes to one of the main paint suppliers, and they're like, well, who told you to do this? Like, why would you want to? I mean, and he didn't go to the actual domain industry first and figure out why they were doing certain things a certain way. Maybe it was cost, the redundancy of being able to create a simple lid, is so much more scalable. I mean, there's so many ways that this could have broke down. So I'm always a big fan of the domain entrepreneur, in the sense I feel like it de-risks things, right? I'm not saying it wasn't risky still for you to go out and start Apricity, because I do want to hear about that. But do you feel when you were taking that jump for Apricity, like what was your confidence level that would work?
So there's two different levels of that start.
Okay.
The going and doing the consulting by myself, there's very little risk there.
Yeah. Like
worst case scenario, I go get a job. That's a low risk situation. I had contacts. I was bringing in work. It felt like a relatively safe space to be in. And I also was just supporting myself. I don't have a lot of expenses. At any time I can cut down my expenses. So from like a business perspective, that was a low risk business.
Makes sense.
When it becomes high risk is when you start hiring people.
Right.
When you bring people in and you have to start paying salaries and you start having payroll to meet every 2 weeks, that becomes a much more risky endeavor. Right. And that's the shift that happened once I moved to Bend and started things here.
Yeah.
But there was some the interesting pieces there, we touched on this a little bit earlier around being able to pivot, but the big pivot within Apricity, or kind of the two big pivots, were the 2016 election was huge because not because of who won the election or anything there, but there, and I didn't have this kind of foresight to see this, but I was working a bunch of military contracts. Around elections, military contracts kind of dry up for a year, especially if there's a change in leadership.
Oh, yeah.
The change in leadership means that you're going to have a whole architecture change in the DoD that then all the guys who are signing the documents for these contracts have to sit back and say, I don't know if we're supposed to sign these documents this year. Let's just hold on this.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of forced my hand a little bit to shift more to the consumer side, the consumer electronics side, and work with private companies outside of the government.
Where maybe you didn't have as many contacts.
I had very few contacts.
Okay.
And so it was, that was definitely a interesting period of time to figure that out.
I bet. So this is like year 1 or year 2 of your business? Or what
we're probably 3 years into consulting, but this is really the foundational year of starting the business as like, okay, at this point,
I'm going to hire other people.
I've made the decision to move to Bend because there's more people here to hire.
Yeah.
Driggs, Idaho, there's not a whole lot of other people to work with. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And so consciously made the decision to move to a larger area. Bend's not huge, but it's bigger and has
big enough. You can
it's big
find
enough.
People. Yeah.
To start hiring people and build it out a bit more. So that was a conscious decision around the business.
I like the fact that you stayed kind of true though to the other things that I think surround the entrepreneurial journey to give you more balance in your life. Like I know you're an outdoorsman. You like the smaller towns. You weren't willing to sort of totally give up on that sort of aspect of where you're going to run the company. Because Bend, yeah, it's bigger, but at this point, 2016, maybe 75,000 people. And I think that's encouraging. And it's also important for people to sort of translate to their own experiences because it shows that you can do these things anywhere. If you just, there's trade-offs to it, I'm sure, but you needed a little bit more of a, kind of a base to hire people. So I get that.
Well, I'd almost push back a little bit because on Bend being too small in the sense that I was in my mind thinking about between Seattle and Bend.
Yeah.
And the business community here.
Yeah.
Once you kind of start going to the pub talks, start going to the things, you kind of get to know the town. Yeah. And you can ingratiate yourself to people and get to know what's going on, and people know that you're there and they can send you referrals and that kind of thing. If you're in a huge city like Seattle, you're one of 1,000 or one of 1,000,000. And so it's how do you differentiate yourself? How do you get to know people? You're just the small fry and it doesn't matter. And so it's easier in some regards in this type of environment to really make an impact and be seen and noticed.
Great point. Actually, really good point. And I think in a lot of ways, I have some parallels to that with, the founding of Manzama and then being able to win the Bend Venture Conference. And it said another way, you just don't have as much competition for your ideas. And I also think for what I'll say are, even in my case, sort of smaller ideas that could potentially be bigger. I mean, I would say, again, I put this more in the bucket of the domain ideas as opposed to like horizontal applying to everybody. It's easier to execute on that notion, right? I mean, I've always said, like, if you move to Bend and you want to start, the next Twitter, I'm not saying it's not possible. I just feel like it's going to be a lot more difficult because you need the type of engineers you need and stuff like that. So not to be discouraged, but these kind of domain businesses really suit themselves well here. And for the reasons that you said, I think that's a really, really good point. I felt like I had a very similar experience and path as far as meeting the right people here, people that wanted to help me like with my pitch deck or whatever it took to sort of, help in our case with the financing. At this point for you, 3 years in, you come over here, you start immersing yourself a little bit in the networks, but you're still self-financing this thing. You're still, hiring people from, with your own resources. Am I right on that?
Yeah, exactly. And those resources were zero. there wasn't.
You must have saved up and done something.
We ran near zero for a while. But the reality is that the nice thing about a consulting company is that you are billing hours and paying hours.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a cash flow thing purely, and what you're trying to manage is probably about 2 payrolls out, because you have about a net 30 on your invoices.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to handle about 2 payrolls, which if you grow, how I grew the company was 1 hire at a time, and each hire kind of paid for the next hire.
Yeah.
And so that allows you to do it without having this huge tranche of money. It also means that you never actually create a huge tranche of money while you're doing that build. And I did that for 5 years or six years of just constantly using the last hire to pay for the next hire.
Yeah.
It leads itself to being successful, but also can be stressful because you don't ever get that ability to actually save cash and get like 3 or 4 or 5 months payroll tranched away.
Yeah, especially if you're trying to grow this thing in the manner that you are. And you remind me of someone else that I want to have on this pod at some point, that they did a service business around some of Google's technology with a back-end sort of customer service database, but it was a service-based business. And we sat down, we had sort of similar, and they grew 10 or 15 million a year. I mean, they were making real money. But it is a thing, because you're also trying to show growth if you want the exit or whatever it is that eventually I think happened in your case. So different type of a stress than, I guess in the parallel in the tech industry, you raise some money, you're not making money for a long time, you're depleting the resource, but eventually the idea is the margins are good and you can kind of drop some of this into the bank account and have something to work with. But I think you always find places to spend your money in terms of potential sort of growth opportunities. In this case, you're 5 or 6 years in now. I look at this as another muscle that we have to exercise as entrepreneurs, which is that the delayed gratification muscle. You're always going to be seeing a need to hire someone, maybe not pay yourself as much, but at some point, that has to start to change a little bit, where you're like, hey, guess what? I've done this thing for 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Like, it's time to sort of see that come back into benefiting whatever it is financial goals I had for myself. So how did you balance that, and when did that ever start to change for you, or the whole time you're like, I'm just hiring the next guy, the next 2 people, and how big did you get? How many people did you end up hiring, and then at what point did that psychologically ever change for you?
Yeah, so I started paying myself. After I hired people, I started paying myself about 18 months in. And I was pulling purely just like base living expenses out of the company at that point. When I first moved to Bend, total non sequitur aside, I just recalled this story, which is, and I never told the guys over there at Bentech this, but I started at Bentech. It's a great co-working space. It's moved around a couple times here in town.
Yeah.
But the first 3 months I was in town, they had a phone booth with a couch in it. And so I put my money towards my desk at Bentech and slept in that phone booth every night. And I was up and out by 5 o'clock in the morning. They had a shower. So like nobody ever knew that I was like using that space as like the place that I was living. But I needed a desk. I needed to be in the business. And like, that's where I put my money.
Yep.
And used that tiny little room as a place to crash. And then went about the rest of the time I was working there, and then started hiring people and that kind of stuff. And decided I should probably get an apartment. But that was, I guess it was probably the first kind of 6 weeks I was here in town.
That's a really good, it's always fun to look back on our entrepreneurial journeys and recognize when we made those sort of sacrifices, and you're so willing to do that at that point in your life, because I look at it as like every dollar that you spend on something you may not need, you could be used towards hiring someone or investing more in the technology or your services or marketing or whatever.
Yeah.
And again, this is just me. And one of the reasons why I like that, I thought about this podcast in the context of most entrepreneurs is most entrepreneurs don't walk into and say, here's $10 million I raised, and they got this fancy office, and, back to the delayed gratification thing. So I always, even when we're raising money, and I think for any entrepreneurs that are on that equation where they're raising money, and I want to talk about if you ever actually went down that road with this business, I always looked at every dollar. It's like I'm spending my money. But you'd be surprised how many look at it. It's like, oh no, these investors will just get the next round. And it's like, well, no, why are you flying to Hawaii on an executive retreat when you're losing $2 million a month? Do your executive retreat, right? Rent out whatever, the Tethro or something, the local.
Yeah.
But it really annoys me when entrepreneurs don't fit that profile of frugality, regardless of if they've raised money or not. Now, in your case, you're looking at like, hey, I got to have it because this is coming out of my wallet.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, right? So,
yeah. And I never raised any money. I continued to maintain ownership of the company. And so that was a piece of it where a little bit of my naivety of business at that stage came into play, where I didn't know much about raising money. And so I took the Econ 101, more money in the door than out the door. That's how the business is going to run. If I had known that was a possibility, I might have gone down that route a little bit. Who knows how that would have turned out. It might have taken some of my stress off, though, in the moment.
Yeah.
But for me, it was definitely just the way that made sense was to treat it as a needed to cash flow from day one.
Well, let's just kind of think about this for a second. If knowing what you know now, if you could have raised money, and it's easy. I mean, you had a good outcome, and I want to hear about how long you ran this and what your outcome looked like. Not exact numbers, but just sort of when you decided to exit the business. Knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently if someone had come along and said, "Here's $2 million, and I want maybe only 20% of the company"? Let's say you got a nice valuation, or however it worked out. Do you feel like you could have done 5x or 10x that? Because that's really the answer with money, right? Is like, are you going to get the same ROI? If not, then why would you take the money, right?
Yeah, and for a while, my line around equity in Apricity was that we are a consulting company. We're never going to sell. We are a cash flow company. We're not an exit company.
Interesting. So you never thought really about the exit.
That wasn't in my mindset. Like I was thinking I could get like a 3 or 4x multiple, maybe. Like that was kind of.
It's a good. I don't want to cut you off, but this is a good point, because I think this is another sort of common mistake. Something I read one time is if we build to flip, we flop.
Yeah.
So there's maybe an exit down the road, but go build a good business, create cash flow. Okay, so not to sort of continue with that. So you're thinking, okay, well, I'm not really worried about that. The most I'm going to get a 2 or 3x on my services revenue or whatever.
Yeah.
So that sort of limited your thinking in terms of, well, why would I raise money?
Yeah, and we are mostly limited by the amount of work we can bring in. So theoretically, if you bring in money, you can start hiring sales guys, start hiring more managers, but then you're also creating this bigger kind of waste within the company.
Yeah.
The entire time I ran the company, we only had one non-engineer staff.
Okay.
And so we had outside sales,
yeah,
which that was a commission-based outside sales kind of solution.
Yeah.
But it was a very engineer-heavy company. Everybody was an engineer, and we got work done. So that was the ethos of the company, and all my metrics that I was looking at was utilization rates of engineers, how many hours per week are they actually billing, being realistic on that. And so I was very clear to people, we're not working more than 40 hours a week. Like, I'm doing all of my budgeting around you getting an 80% utilization rate on a 40-hour work week, which means I'm only billing 32 hours a week because we have another 8 hours a week that we're doing other things within the business. And so it all had to work. Like the spreadsheet had to pencil with those numbers. And if I could push that utilization rate up a little bit, great. But that was how that business ran.
Okay. And that was, and obviously you found a market for your services in the private sector and the public sector as well. So you still have clients there, and you continue to hire. At what point did you kind of feel, or did you feel, was there a cap to this? How many years were you into the business when you started, when the exit concept sort of, I don't know, became a reality of something to think about? Like,
yeah, well, so there's a couple steps in between there. Mainly, we went from being a consulting company to being a product company.
Okay, see, I didn't know that. I didn't know that you had that sort of iteration.
And so when we exited, we were a product company.
Oh, sweet. Okay, this is making sense to me now.
Yeah.
So now you're
Yeah.
the multiple change, but it must have still been a services company to some extent.
Very much so. So what we did is I looked at my, again, spreadsheets and looking at utilization rates and everything. We had a client, Portland General Electric, actually,
Yeah.
who we had been working with on the consulting side, and they needed a product. They were not finding it in the workplace. They couldn't pay to build it,
Exactly.
but they could buy it. And so I got them to write me a PO.
Love it.
With no just saying, hey, if you build this, we'll buy it, and then self-funded the development of that product for them.
Okay, so this is how many years in? 5, 6 years?
So this is right about 2020. So this is 5 years in.
So you're about 5 years in, not terribly long, but you build goodwill with that customer, goodwill in the market.
Yeah, had a big enough team to be able to kind of take a couple engineers, put them on this product full time, and still sustain it with the.
You de-risked it
exactly
because now they're building the product for you. They're financing that development.
And so, kind of as opposed to taking all of our profits and putting it into hiring new engineers, we took our profits and put it into developing this product.
And you felt like this product had application to your other clients in this industry as well.
Not really. It was purely just it had application across the utility space, the utility grids and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Not necessarily our other clients, but once we owned this product, I knew that we could then sell this to other utilities outside of PGE.
So utilities became
a big client,
a big market possibility. And why were you? In some ways, one could argue that could be seen as a distraction. Like you have the services business that's doing well, and now you're going to peel off engineers and do custom development. And then you got to continue. There's always tweaking that goes on with custom development, and then next releases and all that kind of stuff. You obviously made a decision. In retrospect, looking at it, ended up being the right decision because you got a nice exit. But what other than the customer being available, what convinced you so much that was the right thing to do?
We had the skills, and that was what was really interesting is because we had built a services company, and we were bringing product to market multiple times a year for our customers.
Okay.
We had processes in place for how you do board design, how you do firmware development, how you do the cloud code. So like we had just a user manual pretty much within the company of this is how a product comes to market.
Oh, okay.
And so it was the risk of whether or not we could bring the product to market wasn't there. That was why I was willing to go into a meeting in Portland and say, yes, we will deliver this product in 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And at quantity kind of thing. So it was a very stressful period because all of our cash, maybe more of our cash than it should have been, or my cash was wrapped up in this product. But because we had the engineering acumen, because we were designing boards day in and day out, because we were doing all these other projects, we knew that we could execute quickly and well.
Okay. So I'm going to sort of build a takeaway from this because I've seen this parallel, especially for entrepreneurs that are trying to self-finance. If you can build relationships with customers, and then maybe that takes years, or maybe you've been in the domain, however you do, where they can kind of finance some of your endeavors, if you will, and de-risk it. It does two things. One, it validates it, and it in a way that says the customer thinks this is an important enough product to pay you for it, even though it's not yet to market. So you're finding those early adopters, those visionaries, and they're financing your way into this. And I think this is why, I don't know, just for me, I love businesses that already have revenue because they've sort of de-risked this side of it, right? Like this guy's they're already paying for the product. Now we have a profile where more will pay for this. And as opposed to, hey, I got this great idea. If we build it, they will come. And maybe it is a great build it, they come idea, right? I mean, and candidly, my first company, I was a build it and they will come person, and they really didn't come that fast. They were like, well, I don't know, that's way ahead of what we're thinking about. Okay, so I had a software company that built extranets in the late 90s, basically private websites where they collaborate with their clients, law firms. So I'm in the right domain. I'm in my domain. But you know what? When I went to market without having anybody collaborate on this product with me, they said, no, that's pretty cool, but we just want a website. like they barely had a functional website, or they wanted a new website. So we had to pivot and build websites for a while, which I really didn't want to do, Gabe. I mean, I was
Yeah, it's
like,
not a very fun space to be
no,
in.
it was like,
We both know that.
it was becoming highly commoditized.
Exactly.
We had all this stuff around it. But eventually the extranet thing, then I sold that back into them. One, they understood that we knew the domain, they trusted us more, and we sort of built on top of some of those website sales. Now we did have early sales in the extranets too, but man, if I could go back and do that, I would have, knowing what I know now and knowing what I applied in Manzama when I got my first 4 or 5 customers. I mean, basically, even though I didn't have a product, I said, hey, if I build this, will you pay for it? Because I think it solves a problem for you. No risk to you. You have 90 days to make a decision. All I'm asking in return is I'm gonna spend a lot of money to do this. Just, and you think it solves a problem? Give me your team and give me some feedback. And sure enough, each one of those contracts, I'd say there was 4 or 5. At the end of that 90 days, they all decided to go forward, right?
Yeah.
So it was. So I draw the parallel because I think it's a great example of how you execute on a product strategy. Okay, so at this point, you shift. You got your product strategy. Now you're building this. It's becoming a bigger part of your business. I take it after you get that done with PG&E and
PGE. Yeah, we. Yeah. So that became. We continued to grow that. Continued to sell that. It became a bigger focus. It became the biggest stressor by far. And that's the thing that I learned in that process was when you are consulting, you hand over the end product, and then it's not your problem to sell it. It's not your problem to build it, unless you're handling manufacturing, that kind of stuff. When you own the product, you are long-term supporting it. You have full life cycle control over that product, and maybe Gen 1, which had some issues, you have to continue to support Gen 1 even though you're on to Gen 4. And so there's just a lot of stress around that, creating all the test suites and everything associated with that, and making sure that continued to operate properly and work well. So it became about 20 to, it actually ended up being about 50% of the business by the end, but was definitively 80 or 90% of the stress of the business. And you're also, when you're running a hardware product company, which is the space that I'm in and that my brothers are in, the cash flow equation becomes very different. You are pre-building huge, like a large outlay of cash to build the product. And so if you're building 5,000 units, you have to prepay for 5,000 units, and your net 30 is not net 30. It might be net 6 months because you're holding stock and you have to sell stock and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stress on the financial side. Bringing a hardware product to market is stressful and cash intensive.
Wow. Yeah. Which is in some ways, it's a testament to you that you're able to do that in a self-financed way. Admittedly, for me, like when I did raise some money for the technology side of our business to build the technology, partly what I was reducing was the profile of having to take on all that stress, right? If it didn't work out. Looking back on, I probably, and my partner probably could have financed the thing without outside capital, just by virtue of how much we needed to raise.
Yeah.
But the stress of it was just massive, because I was like, well, gosh, if we're not going to see a return on this for a year, I could pay people for a year, but what if I'm wrong?
Yeah.
In my projections, and what if it takes longer to sell it? So hard to dodge that stress and a bootstrap. And I consider ourselves a partial bootstrap, and it sounds like that was probably the biggest time of stress probably in your life. And so what do you do with that to sort of mitigate that stress? Like, what advice would you give to other entrepreneurs that are in an equation, even if it's not that exact stress that they're dealing with? How'd you sort of mentally get through that? Just how'd you manage that? You
kind of go from, you have to see the successes, and that's really hard. Mostly what you see is the failures. And so every setback is this huge setback. Everything that doesn't work is a huge thing that is like, we had at one point or another, we had a product, our PCB fab, the factory making the actual PCBs didn't stamp them properly. And so we spent a large amount of money building, I think 2,500 units at that point. We were a little bit later, but they weren't stamped in such a way that UL said that they met UL spec. And so that was a business going out of business situation. If those did not meet the UL spec that they needed,
you got to redo the whole thing.
We did not have the cash to redo them. And so that was one of those stressful. That was a very big setback. You look at it, you deal with it, you start making phone calls, you figure out how to work through that problem. And in our case, we were able to get kind of a sign off that even though they didn't have the stamp on them, they met the spec.
Yeah.
The PCB fab forgot to print something on it. So it didn't end up being a big deal. But if all you do is focus on those failures and focus on really getting down on those, you're going to fail.
Yeah.
And so you will have small successes or you'll have big successes, and having that kind of list of successes that you can look at and be like, I know this is a failure, but we're still doing we're still doing good work.
Yeah.
Is one of the key ways that I at least dealt with it. Not going to lie. I mean, it was a very stressful part. My health suffered from it. There's a lot of things that you just kind of have to deal with it.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because what I'm trying to also in this podcast at times is try to create a formula for young entrepreneurs or second time entrepreneurs, whatever, who's ever listened, kind of takes this puts it into action, is how to create a formula to sort of mitigate and work through that stress without having like health consequences. Because I feel like I've had some of those too. I know others have too. There's just sort of a byproduct that comes with taking on a lot on your own, and I, maybe there's a formula for sort of not creating that, an acute sort of reaction to it. And here's kind of some of my takeaways from it, some of the kind of thought process I would have about it if I were to do it differently. And I did do it differently the later on that I went, when I was a little bit older entrepreneur. One would be, you got a peer group of people that are in your same shoes, because you're the CEO, right? And you were talking about these setbacks and they're stressing you out, but I'm guessing you're not showing that stress as much because you got to motivate your team, right? So, but you need to find a common ground, a platform where you guys can all sort of relate to each other of all this stuff. So did you use anything like that, or were you just kind of on a solo mission and you just sort of internalize this stuff? Or how did you, ultimately you got through it? Obviously you got the products to market and everybody's high-fiving because now you've overcome like your biggest, this is one of the questions I ask you, one of your biggest challenges or stresses in the business, right? So what did you use any tools like that, or would you recommend anything for anybody to?
Well, I'll take your question and shift it a little bit, because I think one of the things that it's talked about, but it is something that when you're in it, it feels extremely lonely. Running a business, especially by yourself, is infinitely lonely, in the sense that you can't actually, you're friendly with your team, you become decently good friends with your team, but you can't complain to them about work. And that's the thing. It's like people go out to a beer after work and they're like, oh, my boss is I'm like,
yeah,
that's not something that you get to do with your team. And so building that community of other leaders or other people who are in a similar position, so you can kind of talk about that. I mean, that was one of the things that Bentech was good about, is there are other members there that I became good friends with, that I was able to kind of continue to grab coffee with once a month. That's still not necessarily the entire off gas you need. And also when you're in the business space, you don't necessarily want to be talking about how struggling your business is.
Yeah.
You often have to kind of 100% of the time have this aura of success.
Yeah, you're right.
Because if you don't have the aura of success, then people are going to start to question whether or not you can.
Creates doubt and everything.
Exactly. So I will say my now wife was a kind of integral part of that.
That's awesome.
That's somebody to lean on, somebody to talk about, somebody to solution through, who like knew the integral pieces of every failure and success, and to have that communication link was very key.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because I would say the same thing with, my spouse. And I mean, there's an old adage or saying on this: behind every good result is, the person's better half. Like,
exactly.
Put a man or woman as that result. I think it's very true if you have that within your network. My wife actually worked in the business, and so did my co-founder's wife. She worked in the business, so they were able to sort of see all these inflections that we had when cash was not coming in as quickly, or when we had to let some people go. I think that's the other thing, is that people assume this trajectory because you get to a point where you have an exit, that it was always just kind of a nice linear thing. But it might take some steps back once in a while, in our case, even in our case, which wasn't a huge step back, but it was a little bit of a step back where fortunately we had to have 4 people go at one point, and, a company that gets to 50 people, that's a pretty good size number. But, then we never really, saw that happen again. And whether it's your own business or you're doing it for a corporation, those are stressful things that, you need someone to relate to. So I appreciate you kind of not acknowledging that. Stepping back for a second this is where I can drill you all day on this, as you can see. And I'm going to be cognizant of our time, because we got more time here, but I want to make sure I'm, cognizant of your time, because I know you're on your next startup, but I got to finish this journey with you. With Apricity, when you're in that place and you're like, gosh, it's easy to see the failures. I like that you were able to focus on the incremental successes, because as long as that's happening and you're incrementally moving forward, like even if it's celebrating the new hire or a customer in a certain segment, it's temporary. I know it's fleeting, but it's so important to kind of continue, feed your motivation and the motivation of your employees. Did you learn any other things? Did you put any other practices in place? Let's notch that one up. Sharing successes, manage it, that you felt gave you more stamina, or your employees stamina, or I don't know, continue to help you accelerate this in the right way? What sort of cultural things, I guess, because that to me is a bit of a cultural thing.
Yeah, culture is really important, and I think that finding the culture that works for your team and finding the team that works for your culture is very key. And sometimes you'll have a hire that doesn't really work one way or the other.
Yeah.
And it's noticeable when that happens, when it is for whatever reason, they're either not pushing as hard as you want to push, or they're trying to push harder than you want to push, or whatever reason causes them to not be the correct fit. It is
cultural.
Well, it's relatively easy to see.
Yeah.
Once that they have joined the team. But I think we tried really hard to make sure that we live in Bend, Oregon.
Yeah.
You don't live here to work. Right. Nobody is living in Bend so that they can work. If you want to work somewhere, go to the Bay.
Yeah.
You can go work 80 hours a week in the Bay. Have fun with it.
Yeah.
And so making sure that we kept eyes on that as an entire team, and made it known that there are times where we're going to push. Like, we are a high quality engineering firm. There are times where I'm going to ask for a night or two.
Yeah. I'm
going to give you the next day off.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to keep that in mind and make sure that we get that time back as a team. We did the half day Fridays kind of thing. Try to give the time to really enjoy this place that we live.
Yeah.
And reset yourself.
Yeah.
One of the things I used to say to the team was, we cannot afford mistakes. And most of your mistakes are going to happen in that 41st, 42nd, or 50th hour.
Yeah.
If you're it's just the reality. You're not going to make as many mistakes the first hour of the week.
Yep.
And so let's do good work quickly.
Yeah.
And mitigate the number of mistakes that we're making, so that we don't have to go back and do rework or anything like that.
Yeah.
Down the line, which is going to cost us so many more hours than we would have done in the first place.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, pretty key. It was a good, fun working environment. People weren't burnt out. They could sustain this long term. We weren't sprinting. It's a marathon. It's always a marathon.
Yeah.
Business should never be a sprint.
Yeah.
And if it is, you're probably doing something a little bit wrong.
Yeah. I get so much out of these things because there's affirmation and other patterns I see with other entrepreneurs. And I'm really glad that you shared that aspect of it, because, from the outside in, it's always fun to look at a business and see them grow and see them get a good result. And you're like, gosh, this guy, they did it. And that's inspiring in its own way. But these management techniques and these leadership, the way you led through that process to ensure that you didn't have burnout, because burnout's a common thing. I'm even wondering how you avoided your own burnout, because we may ask that of our team members, but rarely do we apply it to ourselves. And we try to go out and work out and do our things, but we're still going to, for me, I would say I'd still going to put in 78 hours a week. It's just when people weren't looking. And I can't do that forever, but I knew I could do it within a certain time frame. harder to expect that from other people all the time, especially when you're the owner of the business, right? So that I think, I just paraphrasing what you said. The other thing you said, I think that I couldn't agree more, was this cultural thing, right? You could tell right away someone's not part of your culture. I'm early in my entrepreneur career, I didn't really believe that. I was like, well, what is this culture? Just get in here, work, solve the problem. Like, why do we? Yeah, let's do fun things. But later on, I fully endorsed that, and we actually came up with an acronym for our culture. It was, we built it as a team, as a company. It's called Pivot. I still remember it. Here it's 5 years later since that business sold. Problem solving, innovation, versatility, integrity, and collaboration. And so some of those were, manifestations of how you work. But in other cases, I kind of would assess people on this stuff. And you could hire someone really talented, but if they didn't fit into our cultural profile in 6 months, like you said, you would see it. And honestly, Gabe, I had to do that because I had some hiring failures, where we had to let people. I'm like, wow, I thought this person was, resume, everything, profile, but they're not a collaborator.
Yeah.
And, with a dispersed team, we had to be good at collaboration. You have to enjoy collaboration. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, anyways, great takeaway for anybody listening here. And this is one of these reasons why I could always go down the rabbit hole and on a long conversation with this stuff. But let's, moving past that, because I want to sort of get to your, God, these are great. Like your biggest challenge, which sounded like was, that switching to product. Now you're 7, 8 years. How did the exit come about? Because we're getting to the point of the podcast where I want to learn a little bit about that and why you decided it was time for you to let go of this business that you spent a lot of your energy and time building. What made you decide it was the time for that?
So what I decided it was the time for was that I was burning out to some extent.
Okay.
I was no longer having the fun. And I wanted to bring in a CEO. And so I started to do a nominal CEO search myself. I just was kind of reaching out to my network. And that's one of the things that I think people underappreciate. And maybe they don't, but I have seen people underappreciate the network as a business owner. And your network is everything, especially when you start to go do stuff like trying to find a CEO, trying to replace something. It's like, okay, I'm not going to go hire a CEO off the street. Yeah. I'm going to go talk to all the leaders I know and see who's interested in leaving where they are or interested in coming and joining the team or something along those lines. And so I was nominally thinking about how the equity structures to bring in a CEO and having those conversations behind closed doors with various different people to say, hey, are you interested in coming on board and running this thing? And I'm going to shift over to more of like a CTO role and running the engineering and executing on the engineering, but not really doing the long-term planning of this. And that was also kind of part of that product piece. It's like running that product company so that I can kind of focus on everything else. Just so happened, one of the people that I approached, their response was, I'm not interested in being your CEO, but we might be interested in buying you. And so that started that conversation. And so I was still not looking to exit.
Yeah.
Even on the product side, I had ideas that maybe in 3 to 5 years, that product side I could spin out into something.
Yeah.
But was not actively out there looking to exit. I think that would have just been a large strain and not waste of my time, but a large use of my time that I did not feel like was valuable.
A big distraction.
But yeah, once that conversation started, it was a very quick conversation.
Interesting. And you were comfortable, it sounds like, with at that point, one, driven by burnout. What year is this? How long are you in?
This is 2021.
So you're about 6 years in.
Yeah, well, we're a year into COVID. So 2021.
Okay.
We're a year into COVID at that point. So like we had been surviving that and everything associated with that, which is a whole podcast in and of itself.
Yeah.
And hopefully nobody needs to have lessons learned with how to survive COVID, because hopefully we don't need to do it again as businesses. But so that was the spring of 2021 is when that conversation happened, and then we exited in September of that year.
Well, so two things that I think are worth kind of reflecting on there. I mean, many things probably, but two that jump out to me. One would be one of my favorite sayings is no se te ipsum, like know thyself. And you're at a point where you're like, hey, I know myself and this is what I want to work. And even though this is something I own and run, I'm willing to be, a CTO and let someone else take over leadership. Now, you didn't have to actually live through that experience since you sold the business, unless you probably stayed on for a while, which is great. But at that point, you've got financial freedom, and you're not, this person.
I had a boss.
Lack of better word, like they F it up.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world for you because it's not, your economics are already probably mostly taken care of. You might have some element of an earn out or something that kind of keeps you there for a while. And so there's some holdback and all that kind of stuff that can happen, which that's a podcast in of itself too, like deal structure and stuff like that. And I don't want to go too much into that. But I like the no se te ipsum because sometimes founders, especially first time founders, they don't know how to get out of their own way, and they kind of have that control piece, and understandably so, because they've had success with their visions and they've gotten to a certain point, but they don't enjoy what they're doing anymore and participate in their role. My first company I brought in as CEO, I just kind of knew at 28 or whatever I was at the time, and it was making good progress. I was just like, I don't know enough to run this thing and have the strategy around it. So I'll do sales and business development, have good mentors, and then maybe later in my life I'm capable. Not to say a 24-year-old or 25 is not capable. There's some out there that can do it right out of the gate, and they can do it for the perpetuity of the business, But more often than not, I think people need to look at their own interest and value add in the business of where they're actually going to, take it from whatever stage you're at.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Because you're in stage, year 6, you're like, well, I want to go to this stage, but I don't want to do this part. So even though you didn't see that manifestation because you actually had an opportunity on the exit that obviously was pretty attractive to you. And now you've exited, you're working for the company, and it's a great result,
Exactly. Yeah.
And which sort of brings us, man, there's so many, kind of, gosh, can you believe we're already an hour into this? Like, see, I totally goes quick when we start chatting about these ideas and stuff.
Well, it's a fun conversation. So
it's fun.
Yeah.
And now you're at the point where, okay, now you've left it. This is this is where I could spend more time on, like, you have, not to get into specifics, but let's say you have financial freedom and you're pretty comfortable. Because you have these events happen in your life and they're life-changing, right?
Exactly.
You get, a fair amount of cash, which you never really looked at before because you're always like, I'm putting it into the business, or I bought a house or whatever I did. And it's just hard almost to have any idea about that until something actually happens, right? Because otherwise it's just talk, right? It might happen this, okay, wait, I might get some, but now you actually have.
Well, it could also be detrimental if you live in that future where it might happen and not in the present of actually just getting what needs to be done today. You can be very distracted. And I've seen that in other businesses where they're so caught up in future valuations, future growth, future whatever, that they can't actually see how the business is run today. You need to work on today's problems.
Yeah.
And have an idea where you're going and know your plan. But if you're too caught up in some number that it doesn't actually exist yet, you can get yourself in trouble. And
also sort of being vested in that number. Like this is that actual number, and this is what we're worth, and that's it. I don't want to hear anybody else. Well, let me tell you the reality of things. The reality of things are, and this is another one of my rules, is you're as good as your options. So you can talk all day about, hey, I think we're at this valuations, we're this. I was looking to invest in this one startup, and they pulled up some numbers, and they said this is kind of literally like right before COVID timeframe. And they're like, these are all the valuations of the last 10 investments kind of in the space, adjacent space. I go, okay, great. But I think you're worth this.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, no, we're going to just hold out till we get this higher valuation. Well, they never did.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize you're as good as your options. And sometimes those are amazing. And sometimes, they're more grounded in reality, but you give good advice too. Like, that shouldn't be your focus anyway. It's sort of, in your case, it sort of came by very naturally and you had a good output. One thing I just want to touch on, because I now know you're on to your next thing part-time, but I know you a little bit now, and I can see it's consuming more of your cycles. So you're excited about it, which is awesome. What happened in that transition period, and what made you decide to put more energy back into the startup world? Did you get bored? Do you feel like you just have still a lot left in the tank? Like, because you're just sort of at a different place, right?
Yeah.
You know, in your life, you know, from I guess even from just financial security. So how do you find that motivation again? And
Yeah, so I mean, when we exited, and exits are tough for that kind of integration into a larger company. Long story short, my wife and I went and traveled for a few years, and so like that was really the reset I needed. As I was saying, I was kind of burnt out, anyways.
yeah,
Wasn't really enjoying the work, wasn't really enjoying being in the engineering space as much, and so we just full disconnected for at least 2 years,
yeah,
and then. Um, I decided, I don't know how intelligently, that I wanted to get back into it and start engineering again. And it's been very fun. This product is it's a good product. It's fun to work on. And I don't think boredom is quite the right thing, but I think it is that I have a tendency to work on projects.
yeah,
And kind of as I opened with, I'm not very good at working on projects that don't have a financial story behind them.
yep,
And so I'm going to look at something and be like, okay, and with this boat monitor, there wasn't anything really else on the market that met the cost levels that I wanted to meet,
yeah,
that met the capabilities that I wanted to meet, that I knew we could easily achieve. And so it made sense to go after it in the moment.
yeah, yeah. No, that's good. And are you able to pursue that in a way that you can have the balance that you need in life at this point? I mean, is that a good thing, or do you feel like, gosh, I need someone in this that is immersed in it like the way I was immersed in my initial business?
So this one I started with a partner.
Okay.
So it's a different endeavor where I am no longer lonely in it, that I have somebody else to bounce ideas off of, to work through it with, to go to shows with, that kind of thing. So it's a much more fun endeavor. It's a much more interesting thing to not just be working on this by myself, building it on my own. And so that is a lessons learned. I mean, there's difficulties in having a partner, and there's things to pros and cons, but for the most part, it's been a beneficial experience. But yeah, it's taking up a lot of time, but it's also fun. Yeah. Like I wake up in the morning spinning on it and decide want to go work on it and figure out the next level of, either it's on the engineering side, and that's why I love doing the business products, is either on the engineering side, I want to solve this power issue, or on the business side, like what partnership can we create? I had a call with Spain this morning about it, a partner device that we can integrate into the product. And that's it's a fun thing to do.
Well, in the profile of you and the right brain, left brain, you have sort of the ability to exercise both aspects of your mind that way, right? Some people, that's a more difficult transition. And then, now I'm going to have the sort of the business strategy thing because my mind can't get off the fact I got to resolve this power system issue. And I'll say for myself, I always liked having a co-founder or partner. I wasn't the type of person, this is another thing you got to ask yourself, where I wanted to carry all that stress myself. I had another gentleman on here on the podcast a few times ago, at manufacturing business, and he had a partner early in his career, and they built a really big business 10 years in, and then the partnership went sideways, and that the byproduct of that was a lot of financial loss and time lost and that. So in his mind, he was resolved never to have a partner again. And he actually did very well in the subsequent business that he continues to run today by not having a partner. And I've known him all these years, this person I've known a little longer, but I've kind of seen him carry that stress through those years, especially the years he was building the company. And it's an interesting decision, and sounds like you're capable of both scenarios. Even for me, where I would say I had a very difficult partnership in my first business, I still was going to have a partner in my subsequent businesses. Yeah. Because I needed that exchange of ideas, and I'm not totally going this alone. Now, granted, you got your spouse here that they're supportive too. That was sort of your partner in your first one. I know you guys weren't engaged at the time, and now you have been, but and are together. But I don't know, man. I mean, that other piece, I still needed both of those pieces to take on this challenge. And I think that's, as a point of inflection or reflection, I should say, any entrepreneur listen to this first time, second time, whatever, get clear on sort of what pieces you need to be in place, not just the financial aspects, but sort of the emotional aspects of this journey. Because you may think it's going to be 3 or 4 years, it might be 10, right?
You took the words out of my mouth right there. Yeah,
Really?
It's a long-term relationship, and you have to set it up in such a way that it might be your best friend, but like you gotta work it through to figure out like when things get tough, how are we going to handle it? How are we going to communicate and everything there? It's the same thing in any relationship that you're going to be kind of tied together for a long period of time.
And I would even say early on, have those conversations before you choose that partner. Like, this is what it's going to look like. This is what I think I want to build for a culture. It sounds kind of weird to talk about culture when it's two people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let's be honest. Like, I mean, you're just trying to sell this, you just want to work on the product idea. But if you have those conversations early, then you're sort of setting a foundation for, is this going to be a good partnership? And I think I was very lucky with Manzama, with Mark Hinkle, my co-founder, who's an awesome partner. And yeah, you're going to have some tense times over the 10-year period, of course. But generally speaking, we were very culturally aligned with everything. And it ended up being one less thing I had to worry about. You know what I'm saying?
Well, when I worked at Apricity, it was interesting. I had a little saying that I used to say that was, I get to work whenever I want, as long as it's all the time. And so like the whole idea of vacation, I remember going on vacations. I took a trip down to the Virgin Islands with my parents and my now wife, and I had my laptop with me the entire week, and I was checking it. Like, figuring out internet service that week was something I had to make sure I had.
Yeah.
Versus having a partner, it's like, okay, you can now know kind of at any moment if they are fully bought in and they're fully in it. You should be in a situation where you can kind of step away and say, I'm going to take a week.
It's a good point.
And that's huge. It's a very nice feature.
That's another good point, actually. I mean, because, again, relating to that, 5 years into my last company, Manzama, I was kind of hitting a little bit of a burnout for obvious reasons. But I wasn't ready to be done with the business. I wanted to continue to sort of build it. But, my family and we went to Europe for a month, and I basically checked out. And even my team members are like, don't contact him. Because he'll just reply, And,
yeah.
And my co-founder I mentioned before, took on most aspects of the business. And it was in the time of a cycle in July when in my industry, things tend to be slow anyway. The world doesn't end, but that'd have been a lot harder to do if I was by myself, admittedly, like it just would have. So, that goes back to the support I was saying. Think about what support you're going to need, not necessarily today, but what's this going to look like 2, 3, 4, 5, however many years, because it might be, like I said, a long-term thing, and good piece of information there that you were able to share. So, okay, so we're gonna move into wrapping this up, man, because I feel like we spent a lot of time on this. But before we do that, because you got through, I love what you're doing today, and I'm looking forward to following that. And you're talking about now you might raise some financing for that, so you're even setting new challenges for yourself, because maybe that's a bigger market, or you're going to go down that road, learn something new that you didn't have to do or weren't interested in doing, I should say, earlier. So good luck with that.
Yeah, that'll be a very interesting chapter to start it as a partnership, but then bring in, I mean, that's the whole thing with financing, is you're bringing in a third party who hasn't been there for the whole culture build, to the product build, to the lessons learned, and is now coming in maybe with maybe only a financial piece, but hopefully has some skill in the region that you're going into, like in the marine space. That would be a requirement for us, at least.
Yeah.
And so that will be another merging of two different entities and figuring out how to work together.
Yeah, no, good luck with that. I mean, me just knowing you for a short time, I'm pretty sure you're going to be able to handle that pretty well, and go for it and you'll learn. And I look forward to checking in on that. One question I don't say I always ask, but I typically ask, is just if you could just kind of leave us with top of mind, a couple of traits that you feel set successful entrepreneurs, however they want to define that, apart from non-successful entrepreneurs. What would you say are kind of two traits that you look for? Because I know you're doing some angel investing and things like that as well. We talked about the venture conference and stuff like that. What are you looking for? Or what advice would you give?
The first two words that come to mind, which are kind of together, are drive and hunger. And so it's that you can go to a job anywhere and get paid. Yeah. To run something, you really need to be bought into it. You really need to be bought into it now and in the future. And it's the delayed gratification you were talking about, being able to see that future success and be excited for that in the moment. Yeah. is more rare than I think I had initially realized. And so that's one piece to it. And then secondarily to that, I think the ability to really put the time in when it is needed. And that's the sad thing about running a business, is that it's going to be a time sink.
Yeah.
And so you have to have the drive and the motivation, but you also have to realize that you're going to be giving up a lot.
Yeah.
In other areas of your life, for the capability of kind of what you can give to the relationships in your lives and the time and everything associated with that.
Yeah.
Running a business is all the time, every day. And so you have weekends and stuff like that, but like that is a key piece to just kind of be aware of.
Yeah. Sort of understanding that at some point you may have relief from that. I always look at it like, when you start something as the CEO or the founder, however you want to look at it, you've got 10 jobs. And then over time, you may reduce that to 5 jobs. And if you're lucky, 3 jobs, you know what I'm saying? But you're always going to have 3 jobs. It's hard so you have to, and that means that also that the company is successful. I mean, it sort of implies certain things are happening along those lines. And no, I think that's important, because there isn't a really, an aspect of relief from that necessarily. Drive and hunger, I love that too. To me, I guess I have a hard time letting these things go, because the next question comes to mind. Eric and I have talked about this before, is there a chip on someone's shoulder? Like, where's this drive or hunger come from? And are you trying to prove something to yourself or to someone else? Like, where did that drive and hunger come from?
I mean, you see it, I'll answer that a little bit more broadly. You see it in all different ways. Sometimes people are proving it to somebody else.
Yeah.
That's usually not quite as successful, because the other person doesn't actually care. So you got to prove it to yourself more than anything else. So I think successful drive comes internally. Yeah. If you're trying to prove to the world that you are something, the world doesn't care.
Yeah.
And so really kind of finding that within yourself, that you want to succeed at this, you want to bring this to the market, or you want to change this. Maybe you're working in the nonprofit realm or the B Corp realm, or whatever it is. Like, that drive to see that change in the world or see that product out there really should be that internal feel to it more than anything else.
Yeah. Right on. I love it. I like it. Well, listen, man, thanks for your time today. This is great chatting with you.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
And I've enjoyed getting to know you too, and your journey. And I think I know we'll stay in touch on your existing projects and other things we're collaborating on potentially as investors together. So it's a lot of fun, and I hope everyone enjoyed this today. That's going to be it. We'll talk to you next time. Onward.
Three winners keep forgetting me, and I lost my money playing poker, so I had to up and lay, but I ain't turning back to live that old life.